Thank you, Renee, for the reminder of mental health, well-being as it's connected to our society and how we as a people are responders. In fact, in one of the meetings, the one meeting I attended, they asked who first responders were. And of course we initially think, well, it's police, fire department, EMT, etc. And they said, well, no, it's actually your neighbor. Your neighbor is most often your first responder, who you go to first if something traumatic has happened. You rush over to your neighbor. In fact, I can remember when Owen, our first child, he's now 15, almost 16, but he was terribly sick. I was terribly sick. And Owen, Katie was out teaching, and Owen was in bed, and I couldn't get to him because I had such a fever. And I ran to my next door neighbor's house. I didn't run, I just kind of like crawled, made it over there. And I said, her name was Denise. I said, Denise, take Owen, please. And I just passed out on the sofa. I was so in bad shape. But anyway, so neighbors, what it means to be neighbor, means a lot. Looking again at well-being and mental health and Jesus as a neighbor as well, perhaps. It's interesting to note that throughout the four Gospels, Jesus actually performs 30 miracles, 30 independent miracles. 30 healings, 37 miracles. Okay, so the miracle like turning water into wine wouldn't be counted as a healing, but there were 30 healings throughout all four Gospels. In fact, the Gospel of John, he goes so far as to say that these works of power, what John would call, were so numerous that he couldn't recount all of them within a single Gospel. In other words, a decent amount of Jesus' time was spent on things like bodies and feet and eyes and skin conditions and mental conditions, earthly things like human beings, material things. The well-being of these earthly, material, worldly things mattered to God. Things like a woman who could not walk, who was slunched over, mattered to Jesus. And this healing of the woman was not necessarily a spiritual transaction first and foremost. It was a bodily, material transaction of things like mind, body, back, experience, perception, and reality. This was the moment that was utterly changed for the woman. The well-being, in other words, of this woman mattered to Jesus. And I want to say that your well-being here today matters too. Now, according to Luke 13, the woman's name is not mentioned. We don't know much about who this person is, only a bit about her malady. The text says in the Inclusive Bible that she was bent double or doubled over. What exactly does this mean? Now, some commentators believe this to be a form, and I'm going to mess up the pronunciation here, but and if you know it, please jump in. Ankylosing Spondylitis. In other words, a really severe bad back degeneration of the spine in a way that causes back pain, unrelenting. It leads to fatigue, neck pain, heart problems, pain related to constant inflammation, and so on and so on. It is, in other words, crippling. And while these generalities, as we discuss them in the text, may be general and kind of distant for us, for her, these were the experiences of her daily life. This unnamed woman, these weren't generalities, they were her day and night. The floor that she saw as she walked to and from her house to the synagogue. While working as a hospice chaplain, I worked with a gentleman who had Parkinson's disease. I don't know much about Parkinson's except to know that it's a nerve disorder that ends with all kinds of muscle, not just fatigue, but the inability to control your own movements. Walking becomes difficult. Things like lifting a fork becomes an incredible task. Swallowing, because the muscles degenerate so much, becomes an incredible task. I got to know this gentleman. His name was Gary. Not really Gary, I've changed it, but it was close. Now, Gary couldn't sit up straight when I first met him. His back was bent over almost at a 45-degree angle. Whether he was trying to do his best walking, taking big strides, as they would say, big strides, Gary, big strides, or whether he was sitting in his wheelchair, he would be bent over. In fact, Gary had a wheelchair that was retrofitted with sort of pads. These pads were almost like an old school desk, where the desk would come out from the chair. And so he had a sort of pad that extended out from the arm of his wheelchair where he could rest like this and put his chest down and his head down as he was always bent over. As I got to know Gary, I soon picked up that he was a bright man. He was lucid. He liked to talk about philosophy. He liked to talk about what was happening in our culture, in our society. He was very bright, very thoughtful. So in our first meeting, I actually got down on the floor. Now, in most skilled nursing centers, you don't want to be down on the floor. You don't know what has been there and whether it was cleaned up, and if so, how much. And so I put a towel down. I said, Gary, can I borrow one of your towels? But I sat down on the floor, and Gary and I talked. In our subsequent meetings, I got to know Gary a bit more and felt comfortable to ask him questions. One thing he told me was that he appreciated that I sat down to see him. He said, most people kind of stand over me and pat me on the back and talk down. He said, you see me eye to eye. I said, well, Gary, I want to. And so in one of our conversations, I would get a little more comfortable. I said, well, what's it like? What's Parkinson's like? What's it like to be in this wheelchair? He said, Adam, it's infuriating. He said, it's very frustrating, but you adapt. He said, you know what's funny? Things that I miss? He said, I miss the trees. He said, I can't see trees. I miss the clouds. He said, do you know how long it's been that I've actually gone to a park? He said, you know, through all of it, it's the simple things that you really begin to miss. Now, for those who are here who deal with chronic pain, chronic fatigue, chronic issues of the body, there's something quite moving on the surface of this text that I don't want to miss. And that is this, that the woman showed up in the synagogue. 18 years fighting this, and she continued to show up, get dressed, put one foot in front of the other. What it took for her to get there, to move through her pain, to move through the chronicness of all of this, we don't know. But she was present. She was in her society. She was visible. Her pain and her resilience were visible. For all of those who suffer with chronic ailments that affect how you are in this world, and sometimes even who you are or perceive yourself to be, I simply want to honor you. I honor you for showing up, for putting one foot in front of the other, even in a day when you feel terrible. The same way we honor this unnamed woman, who maybe in some way today may represent you. Now the text says 18 years, 18 years, 18 years. Does anybody pick up on that? Little Kanye, Renee? I thought you might appreciate that. There's a song. Okay. But what's important is that for these 18 years, time and wounds begin to intersect and interweave themselves. Wounds and duration, pain and months, they shape one another, don't they? Particularly for those who have pain. How we think, how we feel, how we function for 18 years has been in her life, in her world, integrated. Now, some of you may already know this and actually know this much better than I do. But as I've grown to read and understand, there are ways that our thinking and our perception and our thoughts and our behaviors, how we feel, etc., create what are called neural pathways in our brain. In other words, grooves that begin to shape our brain, how we think, how we perceive, how we understand. These grooves become patterns by which we then tomorrow will think, feel, and perceive similarly as we did today. In other words, what we think, say, and do sets, in a sense, a precedent. on what we think, say, and feel tomorrow. Our brains, as we know, are incredibly malleable. They say neuroplasticity is the new way of understanding our minds, which means they can adapt to most anything, but they are also quite susceptible to patterns of thought, to ways of being that can either positively or negatively impact how we think, perceive, and function in our world. Are you all with me? So not only are these neural pathways etched in our brains, forming predictable and retraceable patterns of thought, but even sections of our brain, like the amygdala, that is overcharged and supercharged sometimes, which is the fight or flight response, with more blood flow, continue to demand blood flow. And so we respond quickly, sharply, pointedly, angrily. Or we can develop the other parts in our brains. I went to get my hair cut last week. Now, we often have a discussion in our home whether or not to talk to the hairstylist. Now, we go to like Great Clips or Sports Clips or something like that, where we don't know our stylist. My oldest son thinks that there's no reason to really have a conversation. You're not going to know this person. There's no reason. They're just cutting your hair. Why do you need to talk to them? Katie and I, we try to think, well, Owen, it's a skill, a little chit and chat. Small talk is a skill. It's a skill your generation can learn. Why don't you just practice, see what happens? And so I went into my haircut thinking that I would do, well, at least what I say, which is to chat a little bit. Now, as I was sitting there waiting for my stylist, I select whichever comes first. I noticed one of the stylists was quite upset. I don't fully know what had happened or transpired, but she was not happy. In fact, just moments before, as I was sitting there, she was upset and angrily, and didn't shout, but certainly sternly talked to her supervisor. Their name was on the list. It shouldn't be me. I need a break. And I knew she was in a bad place. And I said, please don't let me have this stylist. Sure enough, that was the stylist I got. And so I sat down and decided I was still going to chit and chat and do my best. What I realized is, as we were talking, I said, she said, so how's your day? And I said, good, it's good. In fact, the kids went back to school, big thing. I know a lot of that's, so we're excited. She said, well, not me. And of course we know that the public school teachers are on strike for many good reasons. And so I said, okay, well, let's not go down that road now. And so we tried a different road, and soon enough that road ended in a negative place. And I realized that every road I was going to take was going to end in a negative place. So I decided to listen to my oldest son and just stay quiet, which is all I could do. I couldn't affect this reality, and I couldn't affect this woman's perception. All I could do was actually be a little protective of my own. And so I did. I kept quiet. Now, I don't share this as a way to shame this woman or to shame you or me. All of us have times when we lose it, when we're not at our best. And certainly, I would trade authenticity for politeness most any day. Now, I share this more as a way of recognizing that oftentimes our perceptions and our pathways that develop over time can create, in a sense, our own pain. That our way of seeing and being and walking in the world and with another can create, in its own sense, a way of being hunched over to where we can't see the trees. All we see is the ground, that which is below us, that which we are suffering. Sometimes picking up our heads can be the most difficult thing. As I mentioned, for the past several months, I've been reading on the psychology and science of well-being, what some would call mental health. Through the myriad of recommendations that I've learned, and I'll just share a few, like in terms of our diet, what we eat can impact our moods. I think it's Daniel Amen, who works in California, wrote a wonderful book called You Happier. And through these myriad of recommendations, like for instance our diet, he says, decrease, and you guys can probably guess it. What do you think you need to decrease in your diet to be a little happier? Sugar was the first thing. Close second, which has a ton of sugar, alcohol. And then lastly, this is the one that nobody likes, caffeine. Sorry, And if you can increase your intake of flaxseed, lentils, kimchi, for example, there's all kinds of health benefits. But there's one recommendation that I want to pass along that I found a little corny at first, but has since offered me a perspective at times that I've needed. And it's called positivity bias training, having to do with how we see our world. It's a way of renewing some of our natural thinking, our neural pathways that have been shaped, whether by our upbringing or by our own experience, that can be retrained through this positive bias training. So, one of the first things I said is instead of waking up with your phone in hand, checking CNN or checking your emails and seeing all that you have to do for the day, the suggestion is to simply wake up, acknowledge that you're present, and say, today is going to be a great day. Now, I know it sounds terribly corny. I even feel corny sharing it. But why don't you try it with me, okay? So with me, today is going to be a great day. Okay, you ready? 1, 2, 3. Today is going to be a great day. And somehow by verbalizing this, we begin to step into a new reality, a new way of being and seeing our world. A simple word like that. And I have to come to the Psalms now. I read them in a way, too, where their perspective is the glory of God. Where they begin to see the world and themselves not as they see or as their worst selves, but as God sees them, as God sees the day and the world. Another recommendation, what I like to call standing up straight, is to record or at least to acknowledge micro moments throughout your day. Find a small, insignificant moment like a cloud passing in the sky, a friend that you ran into, a flower that grows in the cracks of the concrete. Paying attention to these little things encourages us to be present in our bodies, present in our spaces, present with our partners, present with our friends. These practices, along with diet, coupled with gratitude, empathy, etc., can make a major impact on how we walk through our day. Now, I share this as a way of recognizing that while I hope not all of us deal with chronic pain, all of us do move through our days, sometimes in ways that are hunched over, slouched over, bent down to where we can only see what is below us. So how do we participate in our own well-being? Finally, it's worth noting that the crowd present in the synagogue that day when the woman who was doubled over stood straight up, the crowd there in the synagogue, they celebrated. They shouted in celebration for what Jesus had done, what the woman experienced. However, the religious leaders, the healing was anything but welcome. For them, the issue was not that the woman was bent over or doubled down. It was that that Jesus should not have healed or done so on the Sabbath, a religious holiday, a day of observance, a day where God is to be honored. How can you heal on the Sabbath day, a day of religious observance and rest? But what those in the synagogue, the crowd in the synagogue knew, is that the Sabbath itself flows primarily not from the creation myth or from Genesis, where God rests on the seventh day, but it flows from the Exodus, a sort of coming out of bondage, of freedom. It was this release and this experience of being freed people that brought about and solidified the command to rest. And it wasn't just to rest for themselves, but to let the laborers in your midst rest. Let the migrants in your midst rest. Let the foreigner in your midst rest. Let your neighbor rest. Let your crops rest. Let your fields rest. The Sabbath came from a people who had been bent over and kept down for so long, and they needed a new neural pathway of being in the world, and that was to rest and to let themselves rest. Jesus took that holiday and acknowledged the freedom that was brought out of bondage. And for those who saw it, they understood it as a day of celebration of God's good work, a new pattern in our world. I have no doubt, and actually let me say that with a little less emphasis, I have to imagine that if Jesus were to live another 30 years on this earth, that your well-being and your neighbor's well-being would be of utmost importance. May you remember that you are deeply loved by God, fully pleasing, totally accepted, and complete in the Spirit of Christ. Amen.